In the quiet town of Redstone, a story unfolded that would shake the very foundations of justice and redemption. What happened next would leave everyone stunned, proving that appearances can be dangerously deceiving. The morning sun cast long shadows across the wooden sidewalks of Redstone's main street as Silas Boone swept the front porch of his general store. His considerable frame moved with deliberate slowness, each motion careful and measured. To the townspeople passing by, he was just the overweight shopkeeper who'd run Boone's general store for the past 15 years. The peace of that morning shattered with the thunder of hoofbeats. 6 riders appeared on the horizon, their black dusters billowing in the wind. The Black Vultures had arrived, and with them came a dark cloud that would forever change the fate of Redstone. Jericho Slade, their leader, sat tall in his saddle, a cruel smile playing on his weather-beaten face. His eyes, cold as winter frost, scanned the street until they landed on Silas's heavy frame. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent street. "Looks like we found ourselves the biggest shopkeeper in the territory." His men's laughter echoed off the buildings as they dismounted, their spurs jingling ominously against the wooden sidewalk. Silas continued sweeping, his movements unchanged, even as Slade approached. "Say, big man," Slade called out, his voice dripping with mock friendliness. "You must eat well to maintain such an impressive figure. Sampling your own inventory, are we?" More laughter followed, but those who looked closely might have noticed something curious. The way Silas's hands tightened ever so slightly on the broom handle, a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. The townspeople watched from doorways and windows as Slade circled Silas like a predator sizing up its prey. None of them knew the truth about the quiet man who kept their shelves stocked and their families fed. None of them could have guessed that beneath that gentle exterior lay the steel of a man who had once ridden with legend. As Slade's mockery continued, an old-timer named Jed Carver watched from the saloon across the street, his roomy eyes narrowing with recognition. He alone saw past the facade, remembering whispered stories of a deputy whose gun hand was faster than summer lightning. But that was a lifetime ago, before Silas Boone had chosen peace over violence. What the Black Vultures didn't realize was that they weren't just mocking a shopkeeper, they were poking a sleeping giant. And soon, very soon, they would learn the deadly cost of their mistake. If you've ever been underestimated or looked down upon, share your story in the comments below. Have you ever encountered someone who judged you without knowing your true capabilities? Let us know where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more incredible tales of justice and redemption. Inside Cooper's saloon, Jed Carver's weathered hands trembled slightly as he lifted his whiskey glass. His eyes never left the window where he could see Silas enduring the Black Vulture's taunts. "You boys don't know what you're seeing," he muttered to no one in particular. A younger patron turned to him, curiosity piqued. "What do you mean, old-timer?" Jed's voice dropped lower, his words meant only for those closest to him. 15 years ago, I was in Tombstone. Saw a deputy there, built like our Silas. Moved the same way too, all careful-like, as if he was always mindful of his own strength. Outside, Slade and his men continued their harassment, pushing Silas aside to enter his store. Through the window, they could see them knocking items off shelves, their laughter carrying across the street. Silas simply stood in the doorway, watching with what appeared to be resigned patience. "That deputy," Jed continued, his voice taking on a distant quality, "rode with Wyatt Earp himself. They called him the Wall because once he planted himself somewhere, nothing could move him. Saw him take down 3 men without even drawing his gun." The saloon had grown quiet, patrons leaning in to catch Jed's words. Outside, one of the Black Vultures emerged from the store, carrying a bag of supplies they clearly hadn't paid for. "Thanks for your generosity, fat man," he called out, tossing a penny at Silas's feet. "Last I heard," Jed said, staring into his glass, "that deputy hung up his badge after a shootout in Prescott. Something about too much blood on his hands, just disappeared one day." Another patron scoffed. "You're saying our Silas was some kind of lawman? That's hard to believe, Jed. Man can barely move quick enough to catch the store's cat when it gets out." But Jed wasn't listening anymore. His eyes were fixed on Silas's hands as he bent to pick up the penny. Despite his size, the movement was smooth, controlled. There was nothing clumsy about it. "Sometimes," Jed whispered, "the most dangerous men are the ones who've learned to look harmless, the ones who've seen enough killing to know the price of it." The Black Vultures mounted up, Slade taking one last opportunity to mock Silas. "See you tomorrow, big man. Maybe we'll help you work off some of that weight." Their laughter echoed down the street as they rode away. Silas watched them go, his face unreadable. Then, with the same careful movements as always, he went back to sweeping his porch, as if nothing had happened at all. But Jed Carver knew better. He'd seen the way Silas's eyes had followed each rider, noting their weapons, their positions, their habits. The old-timer took another sip of whiskey, wondering how long it would be before the Black Vultures realized their terrible mistake. Over the next few days, the Black Vultures' grip on Redstone tightened like a hangman's noose. They started at the bank, riding in just before closing time. No shots were fired. They didn't need to. The mere presence of 6 hard-eyed men with hands hovering near their guns was enough to convince the bank manager to open the vault. "Consider it a town tax," Slade had drawn, stuffing bills into his saddlebags while his men kept watch. "For our protection, of course." Sheriff Tom Landry watched it all from his office window, his badge seeming to weigh heavier with each passing hour. When concerned citizens came to him, he offered only weak platitudes. "Can't take on 6 gunmen alone," he'd say, avoiding their eyes. "Best just to let them tire of us and move on." The gang grew bolder. They took rooms at the hotel without paying, helped themselves to meals at the cafe, and started demanding protection money from every business on the street. Those who refused found their windows broken or their merchandise destroyed. Through it all, Silas Boone continued his daily routine. Each morning, he'd open his store at precisely 7 o'clock. Each evening, he'd close at 6, meticulously straightening whatever the vultures had disturbed during their daily visits. "Look at him," Slade sneered at his right-hand man, watching Silas stack cans the gang had knocked over. "Like a trained bear in a circus. Hey, bear," he called out. "Dance for us again." But one of the older outlaws, Hank Doolin, wasn't laughing. He'd been riding with Slade for 3 years, but something about Silas made his neck hair stand on end. "Boss," he said quietly, pulling Slade aside, "I heard stories once about a lawman built like that shopkeeper. Maybe we shouldn't..." "Shouldn't what?" Slade cut him off with a harsh laugh. "Afraid the big man might sit on us? Look at him, Hank. He's nothing but a fat fool who's forgotten what it means to stand up straight." But Hank wasn't convinced. He'd seen the way Silas moved when he thought no one was watching. The careful economy of motion, the way his eyes tracked everything around him. It reminded him of mountain lions he'd seen, how they could look lazy and peaceful right up until the moment they struck. "I'm just saying," Hank persisted. "Maybe we should move on. Plenty of other towns." "We leave when I say we leave," Slade snapped. "And right now, I'm enjoying myself too much. Watch this." He strode toward the store, deliberately knocking over a barrel of apples Silas had just arranged. The shopkeeper simply stood there, watching the fruit roll across the wooden floor. But for just a moment, so brief Hank thought he might have imagined it, something dangerous flickered in those quiet eyes. The morning the Black Vultures pushed too far started like any other. Silas was arranging a new shipment of flour when Slade and his men burst through the door, their boots thundering against the wooden floor. "Morning, big man," Slade called out, his voice carrying that familiar edge of mockery. "Time to discuss your protection payments. Seems you're behind." He planted himself in front of Silas, who continued stacking flour sacks as if he hadn't heard. "I said," Slade's voice hardened, "you're behind on payments." With a sudden movement, he kicked the flour sack from Silas's hands, sending white powder billowing through the air. "It's rude to ignore folks when they're talking to you." The store fell silent. the only sound the settling of flour dust. Silas straightened slowly, his movements deliberate as always. "I don't pay protection money," he said quietly. "Never have. Never will." Slade's face darkened. "Boys," he called to his men, "it seems our friend needs a lesson in manners." The gang spread out through the store, their grins predatory. "Clear the shelves, all of it." What followed was pure destruction. Cans clattered to the floor, jars shattered, and sacks were slashed open. Coffee, sugar, and flour mixed together on the wooden boards, creating a wasteland of ruined goods. "Now then," Slade said, drawing his gun. "Let's make this interesting. Dance for us, big man." A shot rang out, the bullet kicking up splinters near Silas's feet. The shopkeeper didn't flinch. "I said dance!" Another shot, closer this time. Still, Silas stood motionless. Outside, townspeople gathered, drawn by the commotion. Through the windows, they watched in horror as Slade continued firing, each shot deliberately missing but coming closer. "Look at him," Slade laughed. "Too fat to even dance. Come on, boys, give him some motivation." His men began throwing coins, the metal pieces bouncing off Silas's chest and face. But something was changing in the store's atmosphere. Those watching closely might have noticed how Silas's hands had stopped trembling, not with fear, but with the effort of holding something back. His eyes, usually soft and passive, had taken on the hardness of gunmetal. "Last chance, big man," Slade taunted, pressing his gun under Silas's chin. "Dance for us, or maybe we start breaking more than just merchandise." That's when a curious thing happened. For just a moment, Silas's right hand twitched, and something in that simple movement made Hank Doolan step back suddenly, his face draining of color. He'd seen gun hands move like that before, but only on men who… "Boss," Hank's voice cracked. "Boss, maybe we should…" But Slade wasn't listening. He was too busy playing to his audience, too caught up in his own performance to notice the deadly calm that had settled over his victim. Long after the Black Vultures had left, leaving his store in ruins, Silas stood in the back alley behind his shop. The moon cast just enough light to illuminate his broad figure as he faced a row of empty bottles he'd arranged on a barrel. His right hand hung at his side, relaxed but ready. For the first time in 15 years, he let his mind drift back to lessons learned long ago. Wyatt's voice echoed in his memory. "Speed is good, but smoothness is better. A smooth draw will be faster than a fast draw every time." Silas's hand moved. In the dim light, it was almost impossible to track the motion. One moment his hand was empty, the next his revolver appeared as if conjured from thin air. The bottles remained untouched. He wasn't ready to announce himself with gunfire. But the draw itself was perfect, smooth, just as Wyatt had taught him. Again. The gun materialized in his hand, faster this time. Again. Each draw was smoother than the last, muscle memory awakening after years of enforced slumber. A telegram had arrived that morning before the Vulture's latest visit. "Wyatt passed peacefully in Los Angeles," it read. "Thought you should know. Morgan." The paper was still crumpled in his vest pocket, the words seeming to burn against his chest. As if in response to his thoughts, the sound of screams pierced the night. At the Henderson Ranch on the outskirts of town, flames began to rise. The Black Vultures' work, no doubt. They'd threatened Old Man Henderson just yesterday about paying his dues. Silas watched the distant fire, his hand still on his gun. He could hear horses galloping, more screams, the sound of breaking glass. The Vultures were making good on their threats, showing the town what happened to those who defied them. His fingers tightened on the grip of his revolver. The weight of it felt familiar, like greeting an old friend, or perhaps meeting a devil he'd long ago made a deal with. "Sometimes," Wyatt had told him once, "a man has to decide what's worse, living with the weight of necessary violence, or living with the weight of doing nothing when violence was needed." The flames from the Henderson Ranch painted the night sky orange. More shots rang out, followed by the sound of breaking glass and cruel laughter. The vultures were drunk on their own power now, beyond caring who they hurt. Silas holstered his gun with the same smooth motion he'd practiced. His hands, he discovered, hadn't forgotten anything. They'd just been waiting, like faithful servants, for their master to call on them again. Inside his store, behind the counter, beneath loose floorboards, lay a box he hadn't opened in 15 years. Inside it was a badge that still carried bloodstains from his last day wearing it, and memories he'd tried hard to forget. The town gathered in the square the next morning, fear hanging thick in the air like storm clouds. Sheriff Tom Landry stood on the steps of his office, his badge gleaming dully in the morning sun as he faced the angry crowd. "You've got to do something!" Henderson shouted, his face still smudged with soot from his burned barn. "They'll kill someone next!" The sheriff's hand shook as he adjusted his hat. "Now, folks, let's be reasonable. These men are killers. If we antagonize them—" "Antagonize them?" Mrs. Peterson's voice cut through the crowd. "They're already terrorizing us. My Henry's got 3 broken ribs from their visit last night." The crowd pressed forward, their anger turning desperate. Through it all, Silas watched from his store's porch, his large frame casting a long shadow in the morning light. Jed Carver approached him, his old bones creaking as he climbed the steps. "You know what's coming, don't you?" the old-timer asked quietly. "Someone's gonna die if nothing's done." Silas continued sweeping, his movements methodical. "Not my business anymore, Jed. I gave that life up." "Please," Jed's voice cracked. "I know who you were, what you could do. These people need—" "I ain't that man anymore," Silas cut him off, his voice firm but gentle. "That man brought nothing but death wherever he went. The badge, the gun, they take more than they give." Their conversation was interrupted by the thunder of hooves. The Black Vultures rode into town, Slade leading the charge. The crowd scattered like leaves in a wind, leaving only Sheriff Landry standing alone on the steps. "Good morning, Sheriff," Slade called out, his voice carrying across the square. "Fine day for a demonstration, isn't it?" With a nod to his men, they dragged forward young Billy Cooper, the saloon owner's son. The boy's face was bloody, his eyes wide with terror. "Now then," Slade announced, addressing the hiding townspeople. "Seems some folks have been complaining about our presence here, about our reasonable business arrangements." He pulled his gun, checking the cylinder with deliberate slowness. "So let me make this clear. This is our town now." The gunshot cracked like thunder. Billy Cooper fell, red blossoming across his chest. His father's scream echoed through the square, a sound of pure anguish that seemed to hang in the air forever. Silas hadn't moved, his hands still on his broom, but those close enough might have noticed something change in his eyes. A hardness, like steel being tempered in fire. "Let that be a lesson," Slade holstered his smoking gun. "Next time the complaints won't end with just one body." The Black Vultures rode off, leaving behind a town gripped by terror and a boy's body growing cold in the dust. As people rushed to help Billy's father, Silas quietly entered his store, closing the door behind him. That night, in the back room of his store, Silas knelt before an old chest he hadn't opened in 15 years. Dust coated its surface, a testament to years of determined forgetting. His large hands, usually so steady behind the counter, trembled slightly as he lifted the lid. The smell of gun oil and leather rose from the box, memories flooding back with each breath. There it lay, exactly as he'd left it. The gun belt, crafted from the finest leather in Tombstone, still supple after all these years. Beside it, the badge caught the lamplight, its surface stained with old blood he'd never cleaned off. "A man who carries a badge," Wyatt's voice echoed in his memory, "carries the weight of every life he takes and every life he saves." Silas lifted the gun belt, feeling its familiar weight. The Colt rode in its holster just as it had all those years ago, a perfect extension of his will. He'd had the holster custom-made, cut low for the fast draw that had made him famous from Tombstone to Prescott. A flash of memory hit him. His last gunfight, the one that made him hang up his badge. 5 men dead in less than 10 seconds, their blood turning the desert sand dark. He'd been faster than all of them, just as Wyatt had taught him to be. But being faster wasn't the same as being right. Sometimes, he remembered Wyatt saying, the hardest part isn't pulling the trigger. It's living with the echo of the shot. Silas stood, his large frame casting a shadow on the wall. With movements that spoke of countless repetitions, he strapped on the gun belt. It settled around his hips like a reunion with an old friend, or perhaps an old demon. In the cracked mirror hanging on the wall, he barely recognized himself. The peaceful shopkeeper was gone, replaced by something older, harder. He drew the Colt, the motion smooth as flowing water. 15 years melted away in that single movement. The gun doesn't make the man, another of Wyatt's lessons surfaced. The man makes the gun. Choose carefully what kind of man you want to be. Outside, a horse whinnied in the dark. Silas moved to the window, watching as 2 of the Black Vultures rode past, drunk and shooting at windows. Their laughter echoed down the empty street, but it wouldn't last long. Tomorrow would bring a different kind of echo. He thought of young Billy Cooper, of the terror in the boy's eyes before Slade's bullet found him. He thought of the townspeople living in fear, watching their home turn into a prison. He thought of Wyatt now lying peaceful in his grave, never again having to make the hard choices that came with wearing a badge. Some fights choose you, Wyatt had told him once. When they do, make sure you choose what kind of man you'll be in that fight. Silas checked his gun one last time, then blew out the lamp. Tomorrow, the Black Vultures would learn what kind of man he'd chosen to be. Dawn painted the sky in shades of crimson as the Black Vultures stumbled out of their rooms above the saloon. Most of them were still nursing hangovers from the previous night's celebration of their dominance over Redstone. The sharp crack of a rifle shot shattered the morning quiet. Their sign, proudly displaying Black Vultures territory, splintered into pieces, the bullet hole dead center through the word territory. The gang members dove for cover, guns drawn, but there was no follow-up shot. "Where'd it come from?" Slade demanded, his voice carrying an edge of rage and something else, fear. No one had seen the shooter. The streets were empty, the buildings silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. "Spread out," Slade ordered. "Find whoever did this." His men moved cautiously through the streets, checking rooftops and windows. But they found nothing. No shooter, no rifle, not even a spent cartridge. "Boss," Hank Doolan's voice trembled slightly. "That shot, it was perfect. Too perfect. A warning, maybe?" Slade spat in the dust. "A warning in my town?" But his hand stayed close to his gun, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow. Throughout the day, the gang's nervousness grew. They rode through town in pairs, no longer swaggering alone. Every movement in a window, every creak of a board made them jump. As evening approached, they gathered in the saloon, seeking courage in whiskey bottles. That's when they noticed something else. Their ammunition supplies had been tampered with. Someone had taken every other bullet from their cartridge belts, replacing them with empty shells. "It's impossible," one of the younger gang members whispered. "We were all together. Nobody could have—" But they had, and the message was clear. Whoever was targeting them could get to them anytime they wanted. "Ghosts don't steal bullets," Slade growled, but his face had lost some of its color. "Post guards tonight. Double watch." The guards were posted, but it didn't help. Throughout the night, strange things happened. Horses were found untied, saddles slashed. More ammunition disappeared, and always, there was the feeling of being watched. Just before midnight, another shot rang out. This one took Slade's hat clean off his head as he crossed the street to check on his men. He fired blindly into the darkness, his shots wild with panic, but hit nothing. "Show yourself," he screamed into the night. "Face me like a man." Only silence answered him, broken by the whisper of wind through empty streets. "Boss," Hank approached cautiously. "Maybe we should move on." Something ain't right here. No! Slade's voice cracked with fury. This is my town! I took it fair and square! But his men weren't so sure anymore. They'd ruled through fear, but now they were the ones afraid. Someone was out there, someone who could have killed them at any time, but chose to toy with them instead. None of them noticed Silas watching from his darkened store window, his expression unchanged as he methodically loaded his rifle for the next message he would send. In the pre-dawn hours, Silas gathered a small group of townspeople in the back of his store. They were a motley crew, farmers, shopkeepers, and ranch hands, but in their eyes burned something new: determination. Stand like this, Silas demonstrated, his large frame moving with surprising grace. Gun arm relaxed but ready. Every motion counts, no wasted movement. He adjusted Tom Henderson's stance, showing him how to draw without telegraphing his intentions. But Mr. Boone, Sarah Miller, the blacksmith's daughter, spoke up. What if we're not fast enough? Silas's voice carried the weight of experience. Being fast isn't what keeps you alive. Being smart does. They've got the numbers, but we've got something better. They're scared now, jumping at shadows. Fear makes men stupid. Stupid men make mistakes. Throughout the day, as the Black Vultures prowled the streets growing increasingly paranoid, Silas's chosen few practiced. They learned to move silently, to watch without being seen, to think like the hunters they needed to become. Remember, Silas told them, we're not looking for a fair fight. Fair fights get people killed. We're looking to end this before it becomes a fight at all. Meanwhile, mysterious incidents continued to plague the gang. Water barrels were found contaminated with salt. Horses developed mysterious limps. Weapons disappeared only to reappear in different places, making the men doubt their own memories. It's like fighting a ghost, one of the vultures muttered, jumping at the sound of a creaking board. Hank Doolan watched it all with growing dread. He'd seen men broken before, but never like this. The gang was coming apart, not from bullets or brawls, but from the constant, gnawing fear of an enemy they couldn't see. By afternoon, Slade was coming unhinged. He shot at a cat that startled him, then nearly killed one of his own men who rounded a corner too quickly. His eyes were wild, bloodshot from lack of sleep and too much whiskey. Someone's got to know something, he raged, storming through the saloon. These people, they're hiding someone. We need to make them talk. But the townspeople had changed too. Where once they cowered, now they met the gang's eyes with quiet defiance. They moved with purpose, each person seeming to know something the vultures didn't. Boss, Hank tried one last time. We need to leave. Whatever's happening here, it ain't natural. Shut up, Slade whirled on him. One more word about leaving and I'll kill you myself. But his threat lacked its usual menace. The other gang members exchanged glances, their loyalty beginning to crack under the strain of constant fear. In his store, Silas watched and waited. His students were learning quickly, each playing their part in the elaborate dance he'd choreographed. The siege weapons weren't bullets and guns, but fear and doubt. And they were working better than any ammunition. As the sun climbed toward noon, Slade's patience finally snapped. He gathered his men and began a house-to-house search, kicking in doors and dragging people into the street. The Black Vultures' fear had crystallized into desperate violence. Someone's been playing games with us, Slade shouted, his voice echoing off the buildings. And it ends now. He grabbed old Mrs. Peterson by the arm, shoving his gun under her chin. Tell me who's behind this. The townspeople, gathered at gunpoint in the dusty street, remained silent. Even the children seemed to understand the importance of keeping quiet, their young faces set with unexpected determination. Fine, Slade's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. If that's how you want it. Boys, start with the church, burn it down, then the school, one building at a time until someone starts talking. Two of his men moved toward the church carrying oil cans, but their hands shook as they walked, their eyes darting from shadow to shadow, expecting another mysterious attack at any moment. "You have until sundown," Slade announced, still holding Mrs. Peterson. "Either the person responsible steps forward, or we burn this town to the ground, and we start with the old woman here." The silence was broken by heavy footsteps on wooden boards. All eyes turned to see Silas emerging from his store, his large frame moving with that same careful precision they'd all grown used to seeing. "Let her go," he said quietly, his voice carrying across the street without effort. Slade laughed, but there was a hysterical edge to it. "Well, if it ain't the dancing bear, come to save the day, have you?" "Last chance," Silas said, still not raising his voice. "Let her go and ride out. Take your men and leave this town in peace." "Or what?" Slade shoved Mrs. Peterson aside, turning to face Silas fully. "You'll sit on me? Make me laugh myself to death?" But something was different now. Silas stood differently, his weight balanced in a way that made Hank Doolan's eyes go wide with recognition. "Boss?" Hank's voice cracked. "Boss, that's him! That's the one I was trying to tell you about! Earp's deputy!" The name Earp sent a ripple through the crowd. Even Slade's sneer faltered for a moment. "I don't care if he's Wild Bill Hickok himself," Slade snarled, but his voice betrayed his uncertainty. "He's still just one man." "One man who's been hunting you like rabbits," Silas replied calmly. "One man who could have killed any of you at any time over the past few days." The truth of those words hit the gang members hard. They looked at each other, then at their leader, waiting to see what he would do. "Sundown," Slade finally said, backing away. "You've got until sundown to get out of my town, old man. After that, we kill everyone, starting with the children." As the Black Vultures retreated, dragging their hostages with them, Silas remained motionless on his porch. But those close enough might have seen the ghost of a smile across his face, the smile of a man who knew exactly how this would end. The sun hung low in the western sky, painting the street in shades of amber and gold. Silas stood alone in the middle of the dusty road, his large frame casting a long shadow. The townspeople had been locked in the church by Slade's men, their fate hanging on what would happen in the next few minutes. Slade emerged from the saloon, his gun belt freshly oiled, his confidence restored by liquid courage. 5 of his men flanked him, spread out in a line across the street. The 6th, Hank Doolan, was notably absent. "Well, well," Slade called out, his voice carrying the sharp edge of whiskey. "The dancing bear wants to die standing up. Noble, I'll give you that." Silas didn't respond. His hands hung loosely at his sides, his breathing steady and calm. "You know what I can't figure out?" Slade continued, moving forward. "How someone like you ended up riding with Wyatt Earp. Must have been quite a sight. The fat deputy waddling after the outlaws." Still, Silas remained silent, but something had changed in his stance. It was subtle, a slight shift in his weight, a marginal adjustment of his right hand. "No last words?" Slade taunted, his own hand hovering near his gun. "No speech about justice? Come on, lawman, give us something to remember you by." "You've already made 3 mistakes," Silas finally spoke, his voice carrying clearly in the evening air. Slade's face twisted in confusion. "What?" "First mistake was coming to this town. Second was staying when you knew something was wrong." Silas's eyes, usually soft and gentle, had taken on the hardness of steel. Third mistake was not listening to Hank when he tried to warn you. "Enough talk," Slade's patience snapped. His hand dropped to his gun. What happened next seemed to defy the laws of nature itself. Before Slade's fingers could close around his grip, Silas moved. Despite his size, his draw was like lightning, smooth, fast, and devastating. The Colt seemed to materialize in his hand. Slade's gun had barely cleared leather when Silas's first shot took him in the right shoulder, spinning him around. The second shot struck his gun hand, sending his weapon flying. The entire sequence took less than a second. The remaining gang members stood frozen, their hands halfway to their guns, as they watched their invincible leader fall to his knees in the dust. "Drop them!" Silas commanded, his gun moving between targets with practiced ease. "Or the next ones won't be nearly as gentle." Guns clattered to the ground as the reality of their situation sank in. From the shadows of buildings and alleys, armed townspeople emerged. Silas's secret army, moving with the quiet confidence he'd taught them. "How?" Slade gasped from the ground, clutching his bleeding shoulder. "How can someone that big move so fast?" "Size has nothing to do with speed," Silas replied calmly. "Wyatt taught me that. Just like he taught me that the fastest gun isn't always the best one. The best gun is the one that's patient enough to wait for the right moment." Chaos erupted in the street as the remaining Black Vultures, realizing their leader had fallen, made desperate choices. Two threw down their guns, dropping to their knees with hands raised. One tried to run, only to face Tom Henderson and 3 other townsmen, their rifles steady and sure. But the last 2 chose violence. They drew, firing wildly into the growing dusk. Their shots went wide, panic destroying any chance of accuracy. Silas's return fire was methodical, precise. One bullet caught the first man in the shoulder, spinning him into the dust. The second took the other's gun hand, just as he had done to Slade. From the church, where the hostages were being held, came the sound of splintering wood and shouts. The door burst open, revealing Hank Doolan, but not as a captor. He was leading the townspeople out, his gun trained on the last remaining vulture who'd been guarding them. "Couldn't stomach it anymore, boss," Hank called out to Slade, who was still knelt in the dirt. "Saw too much of myself in these good people's eyes." The street had transformed into something from a fever dream. The mighty Black Vultures, who had terrorized 3 territories, lay scattered and broken. Not dead. Silas had been deliberate in his shots, choosing pain over killing, but thoroughly defeated. "You don't understand." Slade spat blood into the dust, his face twisted with rage and disbelief. "We're the Black Vultures. We took down the Martinez gang. We burned out the Cooper boys. You're nothing but bullies," Silas cut him off, his voice heavy with judgment. "And bullies always fall when someone stands up to them." The townspeople moved forward, securing the wounded outlaws. Sarah Miller, the blacksmith's daughter, approached with rope, her movements confident as she began binding their hands. The fear that had gripped Redstone for so long was dissolving like morning mist. "You could have killed us at any time," one of the younger gang members said, his voice trembling as his hands were bound. "Why didn't you?" Silas holstered his gun with the same smooth motion he'd used to draw it. "Because death is easy. Living with your shame is harder. You'll have plenty of time to think about your choices in prison." Sheriff Landry emerged from his office, where he'd been hiding throughout the confrontation. He started to speak, but the look in Silas's eyes silenced him. "These men are your prisoners, Sheriff," Silas said quietly. "Try not to lose them on the way to the territorial prison." The townsfolk had gathered now, forming a circle around the scene. Children peeked from behind their parents' legs, their eyes wide as they watched the mighty Black Vultures being led away in chains. The legend of their invincibility had been shattered, replaced by the true legend of the quiet shopkeeper who'd brought them down. "Never would have believed it," Tom Henderson muttered, shaking his head in wonder. "All this time, we had Wyatt Earp's right-hand man selling us flour and beans." The morning after the showdown, Redstone began to stir back to life. The territorial marshal had arrived with a prison wagon to transport the Black Vultures. Slade and his men, their wounds tended by the town doctor, sat in chains, their fearsome reputation now nothing but dust in the wind. Sheriff Landry stood on his office steps, watching as the prisoners were loaded into the wagon. His badge gleamed in the morning sun, the same badge he'd failed to honor when the town needed him most. With slow, deliberate steps, he walked across the street to Silas's store. Inside, he found the big man doing what he always did, stocking shelves, his movements careful and precise. But now everyone could see the grace in those movements, the controlled power that had always been there, hidden in plain sight. "Silas," Landry's voice cracked slightly, "I I wanted to... He reached up and unpinned his badge. "Keep it," Silas said without turning around. "Just remember what it means next time." "But you were Wyatt Earp's deputy. You should be wearing this, not me." Silas finally turned, his eyes carrying the weight of all he'd seen. "That badge nearly destroyed me once. Took me 15 years to find peace behind this counter. I'm not looking to lose it again." The marshal entered then, his spurs jingling against the wooden floor. "Mr. Boone," he said, tipping his hat, "the territory owes you a debt. We've been after the Black Vultures for 2 years." "The town did it," Silas replied, returning to his shelves. "I just showed them how." "Nevertheless," the marshal continued, "there's a reward. $5,000 for the gang. It's yours by rights." Silas stopped his stalking, considering for a moment. "Give it to the Coopers," he said finally, "for their boy, and spread the rest among those who lost property to the gang." The marshal nodded, understanding in his eyes. He'd heard about men like Silas, lawmen who'd walked away from life, carrying burdens too heavy for most to understand. As the wagon prepared to leave, Hank Doolin, who'd been granted leniency for helping the townspeople, approached Silas one last time. "I knew who you were," he said quietly. "Not at first, but I remembered the stories about the deputy they called the Wall, the one who could stop a cattle stampede just by standing in its path, the one who dropped 3 men in Tombstone before they could clear leather." Silas continued arranging his store, but he was listening. "Why'd you really let us live?" Hank asked. "A man with your reputation?" "Because death follows death," Silas replied, his voice heavy with experience. "And I've had my fill of it. Sometimes mercy leaves a deeper mark than violence." Hank nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. "I'm heading east," he said. "Going to try my hand at honest work, maybe open a store." He smiled slightly. "Might even hire some big fellow to watch over it." A month later, Redstone had returned to its quiet ways, but something fundamental had changed. The town carried itself differently now, with a quiet confidence that came from facing down evil and emerging victorious. Silas's store remained exactly as it had always been, neat, well-stocked, and welcoming to all. If customers noticed that the big man's movements seemed more fluid now, that his eyes carried a sharper awareness, they didn't mention it. Some things were better left unspoken. One afternoon, as Silas was sweeping his porch, a young boy named Tommy Wheeler approached, clutching his mother's hand. "Mr. Boone?" the boy asked, his voice trembling with excitement. "Is it true what they say? Were you really not scared when you faced all those bad men?" Silas leaned his broom against the wall, considering the question with the same care he gave to measuring flour or counting change. "Come here, son," he said, lowering his large frame onto the porch steps. Tommy sat beside him, eyes wide with wonder. "Fear isn't something to be ashamed of," Silas said softly. "The only thing I was ever afraid of was going back to who I used to be. Sometimes the hardest battle isn't with others, it's with yourself." The boy pondered this, his young face scrunched in concentration. "But you saved us all. You're a hero." Silas shook his head. "No, Tommy. The town saved itself. I just reminded folks of what they were capable of." As if to punctuate his words, Tom Henderson rode past, nodding respectfully. He wore a deputy's badge now, earned through his courage during the siege. Sarah Miller had taken over her father's forge, her hands now as skilled with a gun as they were with a hammer. Every citizen carried themselves with the quiet dignity of people who had discovered their own strength. "You know what Wyatt Earp once told me?" Silas continued, his voice taking on the tone of gentle wisdom. "He said a gun can make a man feared, but it takes something else entirely to make a man respected." "What's that?" Tommy asked eagerly. "Knowing when not to use it." Later that evening, as the sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Jed Carver sat with Silas on the store's porch. The old-timer took a long draw from his pipe before speaking. "Town's changed," he observed. "People walk taller now. Even the air feels different." Silas nodded, watching the sunset. People forget what they're capable of sometimes. They just need reminding. "And what about you?" Jed asked. "Found your peace again?" Silas smiled, a rare sight that transformed his entire face. "Never lose it, Jed. Just had to make sure it was peace I was choosing, not fear." As night settled over Redstone, Silas took one last look at the quiet street before closing up his store. His gun belt hung behind the counter now, within reach but out of sight. A reminder that strength comes in many forms, and the quietest ones are often the most powerful. The legend of the shopkeeper who faced down the Black Vultures would be told for years to come, but Silas knew the real story wasn't about him at all. It was about a town that found its courage, and a man who discovered that sometimes the best way to honor your past is to choose a different future. If this story touched your heart, make sure to subscribe and share it with someone who needs to be reminded of their own strength. Sometimes the most powerful people are the ones who choose peace over power and mercy over might.